very easy job. It was some years ago, I think, I first asked David Craddock to put his mind to this particular topic about share price volatility. It mattered less in the early days when there were so many more certainties. When you went to see St. Margaret Thatcher about this stuff, I mean, she made it absolutely clear that whatever was done through share schemes was additional to the various safety things, in particular pensions, that everybody could rely on. Now we've come into a different world where obviously issues of share price volatility are far more important. Dave has become our resident expert on the topic.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. Thank you very much indeed. So the subject that I'm going to be addressing today is employee share plans, employee share schemes in volatile markets. And I guess the question which we need to ask, to which Malcolm has given an element of an answer there, is, well, why do we need to address this subject? Are we living through a period of share price volatility? Are we living through a period of market turmoil? In terms of the measurement as to whether or not we are living in a period of market turmoil, I think probably the jury is still out, but it is suffice to say that we are living in a time zone which roughly goes back to the last presidential election in the United States of America, where we have apparent turmoil over a couple of days, maybe 2, 3, 4 days, and then a return to normality, or normalcy as they might say in the US. And we continue with the upward march on the Dow or Nasdaq or the FTSE 100. What I would say though is that I do believe that will continue, and for somebody who is the eternal optimist, and Malcolm knows me to be the eternal optimist, particularly about share schemes, it could get worse. It could get worse. Why do I say that? Well, I do believe that there is a fundamental correction taking place in the markets, and why is that? Well, there are multiple reasons, and this is a deeply complex economic subject, but I've identified two just to bring to the table as I introduce this subject. The first is that there is currently underway a significant market readjustment or realignment in terms of countries, including the top 10 economies of the world, reorganising into trading blocks. Yes? So President Trump has reorganised the arrangements for trading between the US, Canada and Mexico, and he heralded that before the success of that, just before Christmas. We have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, from which America has specifically chosen not to be a member. That again is a trading bloc. We have the European Union, of which we are currently a member. So I raise the question, is this a great time to consider leaving the European Union when the world is correcting itself in terms of a reorganisation of major economies into key trading blocs? That alignment will contribute to this apparent turmoil, in my view. A 2 to 3 day period, then a return to normality and the upward trend. The other factor, of course, which is very significant indeed, is the introduction of tariffs by the US, supposedly as a short-term economic weapon to correct the US deficit. Now, the question is, can the US deficit be corrected in the way that President Trump wants it to be? So the US is a major consumer. It consumes what it produces. It also consumes produce which other countries produce. So by definition, its imports are going to continue to exceed its exports. The other thing, of course, is that the US dollar is the major world currency. And this position is strengthened by the turmoil over the UK, leaving the European Union, and the downward trend in sterling. That's what the financial markets think of sterling, and that has a commensurate benefit to the US dollar in terms of appreciation. But what it means, of course, is that as there continues to be a demand for the dollar, it makes it much more expensive for the US to import, and the converse of that is that its exports yield less revenue. So can this US deficit be corrected? I don't think so in the way that President Trump wants, but he will continue to try, and therefore in the foreseeable future that will be a contributory factor to this correction in the market, which produces these 2 to 3 day periods of turmoil and then the apparent return to normality. So enough really at this point for the macroeconomic perspective. What I want to focus on in this particular talk is its particular relevance to employee share schemes, the particular relevance of underwater options, term with which I'm sure you're all familiar as share scheme practitioners, but also share price volatility, which when a company is subject to share price volatility on the movement in its share price is often a much more difficult issue to deal with, and managing the expectations of the workforce who are participants in the employee share scheme can be very difficult indeed. So let's start by defining the terms as we look into this particular issue which companies periodically have to face. And these were very, very real issues in 08, 09, 10, following Lehman and Northern Rock, and the recession that followed at that time. So let's define what we mean by underwater options. What we mean is a situation where the option price, and a traditional share option typically set at the market value of the shares at the date of grant, is at any given point higher than the current market value. And this is as a consequence of a general downturn in the market, usually completely out of the control of the company, and certainly outside the control of the employees of the company. We then have a separate issue, and it's very important actually to distinguish these two issues as separate issues which we need to address and to which we need to give particular consideration as to the remedies, some of which are similar, but some of which are different, and that's what I'm seeking to bring out during the course of this talk. So share price volatility is where we have a particular share which is vulnerable to changes in market conditions. Yes, so we're not necessarily talking about a situation where there's a downturn in the market generally, and companies find their options underwater. We're talking about where there's something particularly intrinsic in the share price of that share for that particular company, which makes it vulnerable to changes in market conditions. And at any point in time, that means that the share price does not necessarily give a reflection of the company's true performance, by which I mean that the parameters as derived from the company's balance sheet and its forecasts on trade will not be reflected in the share price. A very, very difficult one to manage indeed when you're seeking to manage the expectations of employees. Often we think of share price volatility as a situation where the company is vulnerable to factors in the market. Yes, that is usually the case, but it might well be that there are factors intrinsic to the company which mean that there is volatility. For some 3 years or so, I acted for a company called the Sanmina Corporation, which is based up in Northern California, just south of San Francisco. Absolutely fascinating company, and they asked me to introduce employee share schemes all over Europe as well as the UK. It was a fascinating journey with them. But interestingly, 70% of their shares at the time were in the hands of employees. They were NASDAQ quoted, but 70% of the shares were in the hands of employees. So when employees offloaded their shares, went into the market to sell, an immediate impact on the market, and then there was no trading, maybe, or no trading of significance, maybe for a 6-month, 9-month period. And so again, an impact on the share price. Share price volatility caused by something intrinsic to the company rather than something extrinsic coming from the outside. Okay, let's go forward. What are the challenges? Firstly, the challenges for underwater options, and then I'm going to say a little bit about challenges for share price volatility. Well, for underwater options, it's to maintain the motivation of the employees, isn't it? That they might be absolutely working their socks off. And indeed, the evidence within UK companies is derived from statistics produced last autumn by the Office of National Statistics, is that UK employees are working longer hours than ever. And I talked about that to some degree in the talk I gave to the conference in Guernsey last autumn. I was thinking where we were at the time, actually. I could see people who were there, and I was thinking, well, we're in Guernsey. Not Jersey, but we do go to Jersey as well, of course. Both beautiful places. Yes, so it might be that the employees are working like Billio, but that's not being reflected in the growth of the share price, which is governing the employee share schemes of which they are participants. This problem is, of course, exacerbated, significantly magnified, in fact, for public quoted companies, where the price is visible on a daily basis through a visit to the records of a recognised stock exchange in the press, or through websites or your mobile phone, very, very easy access indeed. And the problem is exacerbated even further by the approach of the IA guidelines, the Investment Association guidelines, which don't lend themselves easily to corrective action on underwater options. So that's something of a flavour of the challenges that beset companies when they're afflicted with the underwater option situation. But what about share price volatility? You see how this is subtly different. So let me just try and bring out the points. Because what it does, of course, if the company has a share which is continually, regardless of whatever's happening in the economy, subject to share price volatility, it injects uncertainty into the employee share scheme. And again, particularly for the publicly quoted company, where there's a daily visibility on the share price. And this can cause a distraction from the business. The number of companies that I've acted for over the years where we've introduced a share scheme and everything appears absolutely wonderful. And then over a period of time, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, maybe longer than that later, the management will contact me and tell me, look David, we've introduced this share scheme, beautiful scheme, it's completely consistent with our targets and our economic objectives, but people are absolutely obsessed with the share price. Yeah. Now what this means, of course, is that they're not managing the expectation of the employee share scheme, and indeed they're not managing their employees in terms of the focus which is necessary in order to achieve the economic objectives. So it can cause very significant disruption, particularly if it's ongoing, regardless of what's happening in the wider economy. And so there is this constant requirement to manage the expectations and indeed the emotions of the employee share scheme participants. And so you can see that if share price volatility is an ongoing factor within the economic constructs that underpin the company's economics, then it is potentially a much more difficult challenge even than underwater options. Okay, the response by the company to the challenge. What are we going to do? Well, the company must have a strategy. Yeah, it can't adopt the position of an ostrich and bury its head in the sand. It must have a strategy. The absence of any action whatsoever to either underwater options or to share price volatility is not a credible response. It will undermine the capacity of the employee share scheme to meet the objectives of motivation, incentive, involvement and identification, and retention and recruitment. So there must be a proactive approach by the company through employee communications. And all the evidence which we have on the success of employee share schemes, which again is a subject which Malcolm asked me to address some 10 years ago, and I've periodically given that talk in different guises around the world since, which is the evidence. What is the evidence for the success of employee share schemes? Now, you might question some of the parameters which underpin the nature of the research, but there is one overriding position which comes out loud and clear, and it comes out loud and clear indeed in my own research on this subject, which I conducted some 20 years ago, which is that employee share schemes work best in companies where there is a participative culture and where employee communication lies right at the heart of the business paradigm. So, managing expectations through communications, and particularly, thoughtful, business-orientated, empathetic communications when we're dealing with the impact on the employee share scheme. Okay, just a little bit of reminder on the IA guidelines, which can be somewhat intractable, quite frankly, in certain cases of underwater options. But for the record, this is what it says. On pricing and timing of awards, repricing or surrender and re-grant of awards for underwater share options is not appropriate. Okay? So any dialogue with the Investment Association has to overcome that stricture. We then have this word on the design of performance-related remuneration, which is really designed to encouraging a regular phasing of awards. I'll just read it. Effective remuneration planning involves a balance of short and long-term plans, carefully selected and calibrated performance measures and targets, and annual grants should make exceptional rewards unnecessary. So it should avoid the need for the type of corrective action which typically we're asking them to sanction at times when the options are underwater. It goes on to say a need for special grants particularly for continuing management, indicates poor planning by the remuneration committee. So it's a real rap on the knuckles, isn't it? In a situation which often the company's management feels completely outside their control and not caused by anything that they have done. All right, practical problems. Let's just canter through these. Employee motivation required in recession. Well, underwater options was a massive problem, 08, 09, 10, going into 11, and indeed the early years of 2012. This was the time when it was necessary to heavily motivate employees to drive their companies out of recession. And yet, did we get cooperation from the Investment Association? I would say very limited, although I have got some inventive solutions I'm going to share with you, which I had put in at the time, some of which we successfully got clearance on and implemented in companies to help them at that very difficult time. Requirements for accounting, FRS 20, now combined into the general standard, accounting for share-based payment. The basis for accounting values is set at the date of grant of the options, the origin of the scheme, and where there's a fall in the share price, it doesn't qualify the company to reduce the accounting values. That share price at date of grant has been plugged into your 6 variables that go into the Black-Scholes calculation. It is calculated once and for all. There are opportunities for amendments, truing up, fine-tuning, particularly in relation to levers, but not in relation to a fall in the share price. The IA guideline dilution limits, not really very helpful when we're working with new issue shares because they contribute to the headroom. The headroom has already been used, yes? Statutory limits for the tax advantage schemes. Again, we're working with positions which are set at the date of grant or the date of appropriation, whatever the type of scheme we might have, without any facility for correction in the wake of underwater options. There's then this really thorny issue of demand for large quantities of shares. So suppose that the allocation, the reward, is determined on the basis of a fixed amount. Let's say multiple of salary is the example I've actually put up there on the slide. Well, lower share prices mean that we're going to have to use larger quantities of larger quantities of shares in order to satisfy the obligation. Not good. Okay, upward pressure on salaries and wages. Well, if the share scheme is not delivering, there's always pressure within the companies to increase cash remuneration, upward pressure on salaries and wages. Initially, the company might resist, but in time, for fear of losing employees, it might rescind and agree to inflationary increases on salaries and wages, which the company can't afford and which is potentially damaging to the wider economy. We then have the start-up businesses, which can't afford salaries and wages at the outset, certainly not in large quantities, and so they rely upon the effective operation of employee share schemes to offer a reward, albeit a deferred reward, to key employees. So if they can't demonstrate that those share schemes are having the capacity to deliver that reward, it can actually lead to the loss of key employees. So what about solutions? Yes, let's have a look at the solutions. Here we get into the realm of positivity. I just love that. Yeah, let's look at the solutions. So let me just counter through these. Repricing and regranting strategies. Well, here we need to remember that the Investment Association is not in the domain of statutory positions. Yes, we do have the opportunity for consultation, and that's what we must do. That's exactly what we must do. So we need to present a case to the Investment Association, in my experience, based upon identity of interest. Yes, an old Louis Kelso concept, which we've talked about many times, at least I have, and I know Malcolm has, I know Fred has, and some of the rest of you have as well. But identity of interest and the arguments which follow from identity of interest, in my experience, certainly during those very difficult days of the last major recession, they are concepts which the Investment Association, if you properly couch them, they will respond with, shall I say, a degree of warmth. Okay? So we've got to be very, very careful how we do present the case, but the repricing and the regranting strategies are by no means out of course. We should not be shy at developing them and presenting them in the appropriate circumstances. Remember that repricing and regranting for that matter does actually represent a change in the terms on which the options are granted. But requiring existing options to be cancelled and new options to be granted, well, thankfully, an exchange of options in the UK is not a taxable event. Okay, so we have that problem overcome simply by the way in which employee share schemes work within statute in the UK. Ensure that the scheme rules allow replacement options when you're actually planning your initial launch. You never know when you're going to need that facility. And then invite the employees to sign formal deeds of surrender as and when you need to implement that strategy. Consider the introduction of a discount for regrants as a buffer. If you do get sanctioned to introduce some corrective action, you don't want to quickly slide back into the same problem from which you've just escaped. Okay, so make sure that at the time you actually introduce that buffer, but do recognise it is a deeply sensitive matter with the institutional investors, but properly couched. My experience is that you can get some agreement from the investment association in certain circumstances. I'm not saying in all circumstances, but in certain circumstances, that's my experience. Okay, purchase of existing shares. Investment association are sometimes more amenable to replacement options if the proposal is to satisfy through existing shares. Why? Because it doesn't dilute the existing shareholdings, and it doesn't result in the creation of additional dividends in perpetuity. We're working with the same block of shares. Okay. Normally the share scheme rules do not create any limitation on the use of existing shares, only newer issue shares to reflect the IA guidelines. So again, it might be possible to find a route through here, and indeed without consulting the IA in these circumstances, to amend the share scheme rules without having to secure even a shareholder approval. Introduction of long-term incentive plan. Well, here we have the whole argument of do we go for long-term incentive plan or do we go for traditional option? Long-term incentive plan, effectively working with a nil value option. Yeah, working with a nil value option. So there is no opportunity for underwater. Okay, that's smart, isn't it? And clearly from somewhere around 2009, I think my records tell me, there's been this increasing tendency, certainly for the FTSE 100 and the FTSE 250, to move into the LTIP type arena as an alternative to the traditional options. With a nil option price, the LTIP requires fewer shares, of course, than the traditional share option to deliver the same monetary value, the same overall monetary value to the employee. Yeah? So it's the full value of the share which the employee is receiving rather than just the gain over and above market value. Always, of course, remember, shareholder approval is required for the introduction of a long-term incentive plan in LTIP. Settlement through free shares, typically regarded as a somewhat radical idea, but there's no reason why it shouldn't be countenanced. And then, of course, remember that the issue of free shares means that the employees don't just have a fixed value because they're shares and we're operating in a market. They have the opportunity to gain some future gain from the growth in those free shares which are issued to them. Introduction of personal performance conditions, controversial, very, very controversial indeed. But if times are bad and challenging, no solution should actually be ruled out. Do remember though, if you're actually working with personal performance conditions, that it can actually result in an income tax charge, whereas the equivalent using corporate performance conditions will typically be structured in order to deliver a capital benefit. Okay, amendments to corporate performance conditions. Very, very interesting area and very challenging. And it can be used as an effective mechanism for addressing either underwater options or share price volatility. So the performance conditions are introduced at the date of grant, yes, at a particular point in time. Those performance conditions may not be appropriate to the economic conditions 1, 2, 3, 4 years on, depending upon the life of the scheme. And so that does give a prima facie argument for saying, well, the economic business case is strong for an amendment to corporate performance conditions.
Give you your 5 minutes.
Of course, yeah.
Signal.
Yeah. Got the signal, yeah. Thank you. So how do we address that? Well, I'll share with a few ideas in these last 5 minutes. Yes, I did. I have got 5 minutes. That's fine. Okay, a progressive use of two performance conditions. Yeah. So we might have a performance condition which is appropriate in certain market conditions, and another performance condition which is appropriate in another set of market conditions. But we actually set the two conditions at the same time. We did this in a company. It was very, very effective indeed, and that company went on to benefit from this structure. The profits-based measurements, say earnings per share, would apply where profitability is strong, but not reflected in the share price. The market-based measurements, total shareholder return, that would apply where the share price is showing suitable increase in comparison with the comparator groups. So apply both conditions, and then you have a formula as to which you're going to apply in the particular set of circumstances. Composition of the comparator group, it might be appropriate to actually change the composition of the comparator group. One of our major clients operate somewhat midway in the FTSE 100. They operate with an average of the whole of the FTSE 100. I keep telling them, and I think they should change it, and I think they are considering that. And indeed, recognise that what might be an appropriate comparator group now, it might be appropriate to have a different comparator group some 3 or 4 years on. Threshold and hurdle positions. Do we have all or nothing? Yes? Well, I would suggest that's probably somewhat delinquent in the current economic climate. We could actually look at hurdles or thresholds where there is opportunity to deliver some benefit to employees and executives, but encourage them then to look for the next threshold and the next hurdle that they might achieve more. So the use of multiple thresholds works very, very effectively indeed in businesses, and particularly with profit-based measurements. Because you can see, the focus is on enhancing the profitability of the business. Okay, an extension of the performance period, not one that the Investment Association liked, but if times are dire, you need to think about that. You need to put it to them and open the case and have that credible discussion. Substitution of relative measures for absolute measures. So consider the use of absolute measures as opposed to measures that operate solely in relation to a peer comparator group. Investment Association generally unsupportive of this approach, but it is, in my view, a credible basis of measurement if particular challenges in the company are not mirrored in companies that operate the comparator group. Okay, do not be obsessed with the use of a comparator group. Change of performance condition during the performance condition. Yes, very controversial indeed with the Investment Association, but don't be shy about raising the matter. Okay, finally, in these last 3.5 minutes, Malcolm, I'm telling you.
Less than that, David, I think.
Yeah? I'll make it 2.5 then. Right, let's say a few things about coping with downturn in the share price. I've just got 2 slides on this. I just want to go through these bullets. Put the downturn in context. This is all about communication with the employees. Put the downturn into context as an investment through comparison to other investments and indeed with peer group companies. So take the employees away from a microscopic focus upon their company and let them see how investments in the general market are operating. Explain the wider business plan. They always should be doing this, but especially during this time, so that they can see the future opportunities to drive the company out of this difficult situation. Give emphasis to the longer term investment inherent in the share price, and also demonstrate past trends, where they have seen success. Recognise trends. Economics is all about trends. It's very important to actually see that things might be down today, 2 years' time, keep working, they're going to come good. Okay, and recognise that this is a time to actually solder the trust between management and employees. And then this final slide, continue to invest in the workforce. Make it clear to them that employee share schemes is not the only employee participation policy which is operative in this business. Yes? That employee ownership culture is, yes, it is about employee share schemes, but it's about other things as well. It's about involvement in decision taking, it's about opportunities to contribute through ideas to the development of the business. Second bullet on this slide, always seek to avoid redundancies. Make it absolutely clear to them that it's not just the employees who are feeling the pain, it's also the shareholders who are feeling the pain. One thing which is very ugly for employees to see is that dividends to shareholders continue, but there are redundancies in the business. So hold regular meetings with the employees, invite regular discourse on the employee share scheme matters at all times, whether the share price is down in the doldrums or moderately moving along or going up into the stratosphere. And finally, keep all channels of communication open to avoid any pent-up feelings. Yes, the last thing you want to do is to close down the opportunities to engage in healthy communications with your employees. Keep those corporate relations open. That's my best wishes to you for your employee share scheme involvement, and if I can be of any help through the services I provide through David Craddock Consultancy Services, please contact me or read my book, The Toddler's Guide to Employee Share Schemes. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
That's a great tour de force.
As far as I can see, it was exactly on 30 minutes.
One of my best friends, unlike many of you here, he only did a week in the family accounting firm before he decided he would give up this working stuff and become an investor. He still rings me quite often, and he says to me, Malcolm, we're long-term investors. And this is the same message as you were coming to towards the end there. In the end, the main financial justification for all this is that over a period of time, 3 years, 5 years, it all works out very well. And that is the perspective that's essential, which I think every employee owner, as well as any shareholder, you've got to be looking at the long term.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Dave.